In the years following World War I, young women across America competed for one of the most desirable jobs a working-class woman could get. Good pay. Clean indoor work. A respected trade. They painted watch dials with a glowing luminous paint so their hours and hands would be visible in the dark. Their supervisors taught them a simple technique to keep their paintbrush tips fine and precise: lip, dip, paint. Touch the brush to your lips to shape the bristle. Dip it in the glowing paint. Paint the tiny numbers. Lip, dip, paint. Thousands of times a day. The paint contained radium, a genuinely radioactive element, only recently discovered, marketed at the time as a miracle substance with supposed health benefits. Within a few years, these young women began literally glowing in the dark from radium dust embedded in their skin and clothing. And not long after that, they began dying in ways so horrific that their case would go on to permanently change how the American legal system defines a company's responsibility toward its workers. Welcome back to the hidden archive where history hides its secrets. Today we are telling the story of the Radium Girls and the fight they waged that reshaped workplace safety law forever. Subscribe if you're new. A new mystery every week. The Radium Craze. To understand this story, you first need to understand how radium was viewed by American society in the early 20th century. Radium was discovered in 1898 by Marie and Pierre Curie. By the 1910s and 1920s, it had become something close to a cultural sensation, genuinely marketed, with essentially no regulation, as a miracle element believed to promote health, vitality, and even glowing beauty. Radium was added to toothpaste, cosmetics, and tonic waters sold to the public as health supplements. Some resorts and spas advertised radium-infused treatments. The element's mysterious, faint glow and its genuinely remarkable scientific properties fed a public perception that it was a source of vitality rather than danger, a perception the general scientific community had not yet fully corrected, since the specific biological dangers of ingesting or absorbing radioactive material into bone tissue were not yet well understood. Against this backdrop, companies including the United States Radium Corporation in New Jersey, and Radium Dial Company in Illinois, employed young women, many still teenagers, some as young as 14, to hand-paint luminous numbers onto watch and clock dials for military and civilian use, particularly during and immediately after World War I, when luminous instrument dials were in high demand for soldiers. The work paid significantly better than most other factory jobs available to working-class women at the time, and it was considered clean, skilled, and genuinely desirable. The technique. The painting technique that would prove catastrophic was simple, and taught deliberately by supervisors to every new worker. To paint delicate, precise numbers, workers needed a very fine brush tip. The technique they were instructed to use was called lip, dip, paint, touching the paintbrush bristles to their lips and tongue to shape them into a fine point, dipping the brush into the radium-based luminous paint, and then painting the tiny numerals. This process was repeated many hundreds, sometimes thousands, of times per workday, meaning each worker was directly ingesting small amounts of radioactive paint on a near continuous basis, day after day, for months or years. The company's own scientists and management were, disturbingly, generally aware that ingesting radium posed serious health risks. Company chemists and management typically used lead aprons, tongs, and specialized protective masks when handling the same radium-based material in laboratory settings. The factory floor workers themselves, however, were given no such protective equipment, and were not warned about ingestion risks. Some accounts suggest the lip, dip, paint technique may have even been actively encouraged as a way to save costly paint material, since the more careful, non-oral shaping methods used less material more slowly. Many workers, entirely unaware of any danger, treated the glowing paint almost playfully. Some reportedly painted their nails, teeth, or faces with the luminous substance for fun after work, delighted by the novelty of glowing in the dark. The illnesses begin. Radium, once ingested, behaves chemically similarly to calcium in the human body, meaning it is absorbed directly into bone tissue, where it continues emitting radiation internally for years, causing progressive and catastrophic damage from the inside. Beginning in the early 1920s, dial painters, almost exclusively young women in their teens and 20s, began experiencing a horrifying range of symptoms. Severe tooth pain and tooth loss. Painful, non-healing lesions in the jaw. Anemia. Bones that fractured spontaneously, with no clear external cause, simply from the radioactive material eating away at their internal bone structure. The condition became known informally, and grimly, as radium jaw cases, where a worker's jawbone would literally disintegrate, sometimes requiring surgical removal of large portions of the jaw, in a desperate and often unsuccessful attempt to stop the ongoing internal damage. Doctors at the time, largely unfamiliar with radiation poisoning as a medical phenomenon, frequently misdiagnosed these symptoms as syphilis, a misdiagnosis that carried devastating social stigma for the affected young women, in addition to their severe physical suffering, and which delayed proper understanding and treatment of what was actually happening to them. By the mid-1920s, it had become undeniably clear to independent medical researchers investigating the cases that dozens of dial painters at the New Jersey plant alone were suffering from severe, progressive, and often fatal radiation-related illness, seemingly connected specifically to their occupation. The cover-up. The company's response to mounting evidence of harm was, for years, one of persistent denial, obstruction, and active concealment. United States Radium Corporation commissioned its own internal medical investigations but did not publicly release unfavorable findings. Company representatives and hired physicians publicly and repeatedly asserted that the workers' illnesses were unrelated to their radium exposure, or were caused by other factors, including, disturbingly, sometimes suggesting the women's own personal hygiene or unrelated pre-existing conditions were responsible. Company representatives reportedly went so far as to have their own hired doctors examine sick former workers and then deliberately withhold or misrepresent the actual diagnostic findings from the workers themselves and their families. A pivotal turning point came through the independent efforts of Dr. Harrison Martland, a New Jersey medical examiner, who conducted rigorous scientific studies beginning around 1925, definitively linking the workers' devastating symptoms to internal radium poisoning through careful post-mortem and clinical analysis, providing independent, credible scientific evidence the companies could no longer simply dismiss or explain away. Despite this mounting, credible scientific evidence, the companies continued to resist both public acknowledgement of the connection and, crucially, resisted providing any meaningful compensation to the by then seriously ill and dying former employees for years afterward. The legal fight. In 1927, a small group of severely ill former dial painters from the New Jersey plant, 5 women who came to be known publicly and sympathetically in the press as the Radium Girls, filed a lawsuit against United States Radium Corporation. The case faced enormous legal obstacles. New Jersey's statute of limitations for workplace injury claims at the time was extremely short, just 2 years from the date of injury, and the company's legal teams initially argued the claims were filed too late, despite the fact that the women's conditions were progressive, cumulative illnesses whose full severity often only became clear years after their actual workplace exposure had ended. The women were, by this point in the legal proceedings, severely physically debilitated. Several were unable to raise their arms to take the courtroom oath without assistance, illustrating starkly and publicly, for the press and public alike, the severity of their condition. The case attracted significant, sympathetic national media attention, which proved genuinely important in building public pressure. Facing mounting public outrage and unfavorable press coverage, United States Radium Corporation eventually agreed to a settlement in 1928 providing the surviving women with financial compensation and covering ongoing medical expenses, though tragically, several of the original plaintiffs died from their radiation-related illnesses within a relatively short time after the settlement was finalized. Similar, related litigation and labor disputes involving dial painters at the separate Radium Dial Company plant in Ottawa, Illinois continued into the following decade, into the 1930s, eventually reaching the Illinois Supreme Court and resulting in further legal precedents specifically establishing employer liability for long-term occupational radiation exposure. The twist. Here is the twist that gives this genuinely tragic story its lasting historical significance. The Radium Girls' legal battles directly and measurably influenced the development of modern occupational safety law and regulation in the United States. Their cases established crucial and lasting legal precedent, that employers could indeed be held legally liable for long-term, cumulative occupational illnesses, not just sudden, obvious workplace accidents, and that employers bore genuine responsibility for adequately informing workers of known or reasonably knowable health hazards associated with materials they were required to handle. The scientific research and documented medical evidence generated directly from studying the Radium Girls cases also became foundational to the broader field of health physics, the scientific discipline specifically concerned with radiation protection and safety, established in direct response to lessons learned from these cases and directly informed early radiation exposure safety standards subsequently adopted for workers on the Manhattan Project during World War II, helping establish maximum permissible radiation exposure limits still used, in updated and refined forms, in nuclear industry safety standards today. In a very real and direct sense, the tragic suffering, courage, and persistent public legal fight of a relatively small group of young factory workers in the 1920s helped establish the fundamental legal and scientific framework that protects workers in radiation-related industries around the world to this very day. The Radium Girls were young women who took what seemed, at the time, like a good and desirable job painting glowing numbers onto watch dials, following the exact instructions their employers gave them. Many paid for that trust with their health, and ultimately, with their lives, but their refusal to stay silent, and their willingness to fight a powerful company in court despite their own declining health, fundamentally changed how the law defines a company's responsibility to protect the people who work for it, a legal and scientific legacy that still protects workers in hazardous industries today, nearly a century later. Sometimes light comes from unexpected places, even from a story that begins in genuine tragedy. What part of their story affected you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the Hidden Archive, a new mystery, every week, where history hides its secrets. End.